You might have seen that Ozempic study, the Journal of Endocrine Society. It was like 1,961 people. Pretty massive reductions in visceral fat over like a significant period of time using a GLP-1 receptor agonist. It was pretty impressive. It was like almost 25% reduction in visceral fat. So that's great, but the only downside with that study is I didn't want it to just encourage a lot of people to, I don't want to say take the easy way out, but just hop on Ozempic to try to lose visceral fat. And let me be very clear that if that's what you have to do to get that visceral fat off, I'm in full support of that. Like, I feel like that is such an inflammatory fat. Visceral fat is cardiometabolically active. It is inflammatory. It is the most dangerous, most lethal fat on our bodies. So if that's how it comes off, I get it. But we need to have a strategy to A, maintain that, or B, better yet, a strategy that we can go through first to try to lose as much visceral fat as possible without utilizing something like Ozempic. So we'll talk about kind of the strategies along this same mechanistic pathway. Let's go ahead and jump in. And now before we get into it, I put a link down to our sponsor below, which is Timeline Nutrition. This stuff is so amazingly cool in terms of literature. I'm always on the cutting edge stuff. This is something called urolithin A using a patented form called MitoPure. So it actually changes the mitochondria, encourages the mitochondria to go through what's called mitophagy, where you actually allow the mitochondria to become stronger and essentially replicate stronger. And there's really solid evidence published in JAMA, published in other journals on this, very strong clinical data. This is not something that's just a fly-by-night compound. It's called a postbiotic. So the gut usually breaks it down and creates a new compound out of it called urolithin A. But this is in a concentrated form. So I highly recommend you try it. That link down below gets you 10% off. It's something that definitely plays a part with visceral fat, with muscle health, and with overall longevity. So that link is down below in the top line of the description, and a big thank you to them for the continued support over the last few years on this channel. So now I want to bring to your attention another study that looked at visceral fat. It was published in Frontiers of Nutrition. What was interesting about this study is they took a look at high-intensity interval training compared to a couple different, or actually one, key different dietary intervention. Now the reason that I want to bring this to mind is because you may have remembered, or maybe you saw I had a really interesting guest on my channel a while back, Dr. Sean O'Mara, who is the world's leading expert in visceral fat. And he talked many times about how high-intensity interval training and that beta-adrenergic response that you get from the high-intensity interval training is so important for visceral fat loss. And he's dead on, like there is a mechanistic pathway there, but this study is interesting because it looked at HIIT versus a very low-carb diet, short-term, as well as a separate arm that was HIIT plus a very low-carb diet. What's really wild about this study is that the HIIT-only group didn't have any reduction in visceral fat, but the very low-carb group had pretty significant reductions in visceral fat with no exercise. And then the group that had low-carb plus high-intensity interval training had significant reductions in visceral fat. Now, I am not suggesting you have to go low-carb. You may or may not know me and know my story. Yes, I have a lot of experience on a lower carb protocol, but I'm not necessarily low carb now. But I do go through periods of time where I surge it. What this study is illuminating for us is that we can go periods of time, like 4 weeks of very low carb, along with high intensity interval training during those 4-week periods, and have aggressive visceral fat loss. Now, why is this happening? Well, if we look at a study that was published in Nutrition Metabolism, it was quite interesting because it demonstrated that there is what is called an adrenergic stimulation. This is a very muscle-sparing process in the body when you have this adrenergic stimulation, but it also creates a little bit of a stress shock to the body. So this stress shock that is induced from the ketones or the low-carb diet, in this case, in a short term, actually allows for the visceral fat to be liberated quicker, which is exactly why we saw reductions in visceral fat on a very low-carb diet, even without exercise. Now, when you look at high-intensity interval training is another stress shock. So combining and stacking these temporary stress shocks is not only good for total fat loss, but exceptionally good for visceral fat. Now, what is going on here? Well, it's because we have what are called glucocorticoid receptors in our abdominal fat. Have you ever seen those old commercials that talked about like cortisol and belly fat? I remember them from like the late 90s, early 2000s. Like that is a legit thing. The only downside with those is it kind of paints this picture as cortisol being bad when cortisol is not necessarily bad. It's bad when it's chronically elevated. It should be pulsing at the right time, right? But we want to have a certain level of stress But we want to have that stress in the absence of carbohydrates or in the absence of fuel, okay? Because if we have stress in the presence of carbohydrates, cortisol plus insulin is not ideal. It's beyond not ideal. It's not good, okay? That is how you store fat. And that is how we're seeing you store visceral fat. It is not pseudoscience to say that stress causes abdominal fat accumulation. That is legit, that is demonstrated, that is strong literature. Okay, but where people get confused is it's more about visceral fat versus just central adiposity like regular belly fat. It's a visceral fat. So when you cause a preferred stress response with high intensity interval training, you can burn more visceral fat. But as we saw in that first Frontiers in Nutrition study, the high intensity interval training didn't lose visceral fat. Well, probably because they were consuming fuel before doing it. And I'm sure if you did it for a long enough period of time and you were in enough of a deficit, it would work. Based on this initial sort of Ozempic study I opened with, they weren't doing exercise. They lost visceral fat because they were in a severe deficit. So yeah, HIIT will work if you're in a deficit. But if you're not in a deficit, it's probably not going to do a ton other than build your capacity, like your work capacity for actual running or training or VO2 max. But when we look at it as combined with reduction of carbohydrates, we get this adrenergic response, this norepinephrine response that actually targets those glucocorticoid receptors on the visceral fat more, allowing the high intensity interval training to do its job. So to be able to lose visceral fat without Ozempic, you need to A, probably reduce carbohydrates, and B, do that high intensity interval training in that low carb state or fasted state, and you don't need to do it for long periods of time. Because once you start increasing the stress too much, then the stress becomes problematic and becomes chronic. So we're talking short, intense bursts in a depleted, caloric deficit, low carb state. Okay, so that looks something like 3 to 4 weeks of low carb, probably reducing calories, and doing perhaps 1 minute on, maybe 2 minutes off for 5 to 7 rotations a few times per week. Ideally every day, if you're on just a mission to lose visceral fat. You might be thinking like, well, how do I combine all my other stuff, all my resistance training? That would make for a 30-minute video, and I have to be careful there, right? I could give you this whole protocol, all these playbooks, but if your goal is, hey, for the next month, I want to go on a mission to reduce visceral fat, this is what you would do. You would prioritize the HIIT training. You would put yourself into a very low carb, even ketogenic state, so where you preserve muscle, lose your appetite, have the adrenergic stimulation, and then do the HIIT training to trigger those glucocorticoid receptors on the visceral fat to liberate it more. Okay, so if Ozempic is how you get there initially, I'm all for that. That's fine. But when you come off of that stuff, you need to transition into something like this to maintain the benefit, and until you establish a new lifestyle and metabolic flexibility to actually hold on to it. So as always, please keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.